Hello, welcome back to the Personality Junkie podcast after a very long hiatus. I'm Elaine Shallock.
And I'm AJ Drenth. How long's it been anyway? 2018 maybe that we recorded our last podcast?
I think it's been longer than that.
Pre-COVID for sure.
Pre-COVID, pre-baby.
Right. Lots of things have happened since we recorded our last podcast. We're probably considered ancient as far as our technology too at this point, but who knows?
So AJ and I have been batting around topics for this podcast for a little while, knowing that we wanted to dabble back into podcasting. And probably in part the reason that we've been away for so long, in addition to having a baby and, COVID, it was that I've been working on finishing my book.
Congrats on that, Elaine.
Thanks. Beyond Rare.
Actually, you gave birth twice at the same time almost, because we published your book a day or two after essentially our baby was born. Right.
So within a couple of months, really,
So Elaine's been a busy woman.
Two big things happened.
I guess I've been busy too, though.
I mean... All right, so on that note, being busy, or in the case of taking a really long time to get back around to podcasting, the topic we're going to go into today is about IN types and the struggle to act. And this is a topic that I talked a lot about in my book, actually. And while, the book is mostly tailored to INFJs, there are pieces of,
Actually, lots of it, I think, applies across all IN types. Which include INFPs, INTPs, INTJs, in addition to INFJs.
Right. But I really feel like you see the struggle to move into action in a fairly pronounced way with the NI dominance, so both INFJs and INTJs. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
And in large part, that's due to the S function being inferior in those types, presumably.
Right.
And we associate sensing, which in this case is INJ's inferior SE function, we associate that with action. If intuition is sort of the function of reflection, it's more of a mental action, if you will, running things through in the mind's eye, considering potential courses of action, coming up with ideas for actions, having insights that might lead to actions. All of these things emerge from intuition. And on the flip side, we have the sensing function, which is more inclined to take action, perhaps spontaneously in the case of ESP types, who are very good at just responding and reacting. And this gives them certain advantages in some arenas, such as athletics or anything involving working with the hands, even in performance, where it's more instinctive action.
Like being quick on your feet.
Exactly.
Right.
So we have this contrast between types that lead with intuition and introversion, the IN types, versus your SE extrovert types, in which the action just comes, like I said, almost reflexively and quite quickly. And so what we end up with for IN types is these types have both sensing and extroversion in the bottom parts of their function stack, so in the tertiary and inferior functions, which, as we know from what we've written a lot about on Personality Junkie, the inferior functions are naturally the most difficult to access and to harness and capitalize on for every type.
Right. And so, again, for the types in which you've got the N and S effectively at the opposite ends of the stack, so as the dominant versus inferior function, making the jump just becomes that much harder. That IN types like me and other INFJs and INTJs spend a lot of time preparing and rehearsing and kind of ruminating in their own heads before feeling like they're actually ready to
Prepared to act. And so what can happen, it seems like IN types can become frustrated because they end up feeling like they have all these great ideas, all these great plans, but yet they can't seem to get them off the ground. And there's a sense of, if this happens often enough, that you're just kind of a spectator in life rather than living life in some ways, especially vis-a-vis the extroverted and sensing types who are out there doing and acting and buying homes and working jobs and earning
sometimes multiple jobs,
having multiple kids. And for the IN type who's slower to do all those things in all likelihood, it can seem like life is kind of just leaving them behind in a way.
Right. So there's a wanting to get something straight on the front end, or kind of to mentally work out theoretically, conceptually on the front end how something might effectively work in reality or in a practical way before just like diving right in and trying it. Whereas with like S dominance, they don't want to sit around in a classroom studying before learning how to get their hands dirty. They'd like to just try it and fix it as they go, or like make it work as they go. And so in that sense, I feel like there's less of a fear of failure, especially for extroverted sensing types. There's a sense that if something doesn't work, they'll just try something else.
They'll just kind of make adjustments as needed as they go along.
Right.
And I like the example that you've talked about in the past, like the difference between maybe an INTJ who might study the physics of how to swing a baseball bat and do all the math and look at all the vectors and really could analyze and maybe give us physics 101 on how a baseball is hit with a bat. Whereas an ESTP might step up to the plate and say, I don't need all that. I can just show you how to hit the ball.
Right.
And there's just like a natural...
Yeah, the need to know conceptually the physics behind a great swing or whatever it takes with angles and momentum and all of that is...
A great hitter doesn't need the INTJ's manual. Exactly.
No, they just feel it in their own.
And in fact, a great
bone.
hitter would probably find that their swing is greatly disrupted in trying to follow the INTJ's manual.
Right. So I'll out AJ here and let the audience know that he used to play basketball in his high school years. So, and we've talked about this before.
That's exactly why I didn't use basketball in the example. It's too close to home.
But yeah, like the ability to get out of your own head and just be present in your own body when you're doing something like playing basketball or playing any sport is really an advantage. You can almost see it in the athlete's mind, or see it kind of written on their face when they get kind of stuck in a cycle of overthinking things. Or they miss
free throws in particular.
Like they miss a shot or two, or a couple bad shots in a row, and then they start ruminating, or they kind of lose the flow of what they're doing, and then they can't kind of break their way. If they get too lost in their head, they can't break their way out of it.
And the same fear actually plagues me with doing podcasting, which was probably why we took so many years off, is because AJ is terrified of being in front of a microphone. It's the Enneagram 5 and INTJs and INTPs and all the IN types have this issue in a way. If we can just plan everything out in advance and think through all the talking points, think through all the potential questions or issues that could come up, so we can have a good, excellent, complete, comprehensive, whatever you want to call it, podcast. What ends up happening is there's either a robotic aspect that can come into it for INT types, or we just feel frozen like a deer in the headlights because we're worried that our bullet points aren't going to get covered or what have you. And so consequently, that can just lead to inaction for me and for others, which is based in fear and all the
I think a lot of
dreaded, what if this happens?
Well, I think a lot of that comes down to a fear of failure. And by failure, I mean like a fear of... I think failure is defined differently for different types. We all may have some of the same basic fears, like the fear of looking like a fool or an idiot, especially in front of an audience. And if you're a sports star, you've got a huge audience potentially watching you. So that prospect is terrifying. But I also think like for INFJs or maybe even any of the INJs, it's been noted more than a few times that perfectionism is a trait. So wanting to kind of know or visualize exactly what the outcome is going to be in advance of actually performing the action, that standard is so high, it kind of creates this impossible bar. Like you never start anything because you want it to be just right out of the gate, but
well,
that's not really realistic.
Like more planning and more preparation and more thinking and analyzing is always possible, right? There's always something that you could potentially add to a presentation or a book, but at some point it has to be circumscribed unless you just have no concern at all for ever publishing or finishing the work.
Right. And so in the book I note that for INFJs, life starts to look like one giant dress rehearsal. And I think that's probably where the secret sauce is. Like if INFJs could learn, or really any IN types could learn, that this is what S types probably know, although maybe they don't know that they know this, but this is what S types know, which is that, like, in effect, the dress rehearsal is the action. And so there's less of a fear of failure for ES types because every time they perform an action, it's just another opportunity to hone their skills and get better. And so it creates a lot more grace and forgiveness for making mistakes in a way that it seems like IN types aren't apt or open to allowing to be the case, because they want to get it right the first time. Or at least I know that's something that, as an INFJ, that has plagued me. The desire and want to get it right the first time, and the feeling that if you mess it up once or you mess it up the first time, like the whole thing is a disgrace and you may as well...
Well, you once prided yourself in only wanting to write one draft of a document.
It's true. I used to see the idea of a rough draft as unnecessary, or it's like that saying, if you're going to do it right the first time. I think that INJs on some level can all kind of resonate with that sentiment or desire, like give it 100%, but expecting that from yourself is just so unbelievably unreasonable. And what happens is, as AJ noted earlier, that it just often ends up backfiring. It often ends up creating absolutely no action and arguably keeps them stuck for longer without accomplishing anything until they end up feeling a sense of failure anyway, because they haven't even tried, so they haven't accomplished. So it's like you can try and fail, or you can not try and fail.
And I feel like as INs get older, the pressure to actually do something becomes greater. If we think in terms of type development, as time goes on, there's almost a natural rhythm to the psyche that says you've done your introverted, your intuitive stuff for 10, 20, 30 years, but you haven't really done much of what you hope to do. You haven't published your album or published your book or whatever hopes and dreams you might have as an IN type. And as time continues to march on, there does seem to be a greater sense of urgency to the point where, I mean, maybe you experienced this with your book, and you had a conception of a book for quite a while before you even started working on it. And it's like the psyche almost won't allow you to continue with inaction past a certain point because the possibility of regret gets too strong.
Right, that's absolutely true. And that's what I mean by failure, because I think once the light bulb goes off for IN types when they realize, look, not trying to do the thing or not taking action is now costing me as much or more than taking the action and possibly making a mistake along the way, or possibly looking like a fool along the way, or, whatever the case may be, that once that pressure mounts and you recognize that, you're kind of looking at, this sounds very tragic, but you're kind of looking at failure in either direction, which is effectively what that is. It's like you do reach that point where you've got a guaranteed 100% chance of failure if you don't try, versus like, I don't know, maybe like a 98% chance of failure if you do try.
I truly believe the notion, though, that you're more apt to regret something that you didn't try than having never tried at all, right? Better to have tried and failed than to never have tried at all.
Yeah, or loved and lost, isn't that the saying? But yeah, same, I guess it's the same at it. I mean, but usually it's like ES types that like to throw that one around, because I don't think anybody likes being made a fool of. I don't think ES types relish making a mistake in front of a large audience and looking like a fool either, but one gets a sense that the like degree of stage fright for these kinds of extroverts, and especially when it comes to action, is just, they understand that if at first you don't succeed, you need to try again. And really what we're talking about in some ways comes down to the what. It comes down to what action are we talking about? You know, like I think about my grandfather was an INTP and a tinkerer.
Poor guy.
Yeah, I know. Those INTPs don't have an easy go of it, but you know, he was an electrical engineer, and he was like a tinkerer, and he probably invented, I don't know how many, probably hundreds of different.
I think his whole house was held up by duct tape.
I mean, pretty much.
By the time he passed away, it was
pretty much, yeah. That house was pretty much electrical tape and duct tape, and he had switches for everything to turn on everything. But he might have an idea for something. You know, if I kind of manufactured such and such and hooked up this wire to this and that, I might be able to get this to go off on a timer, and that would be convenient because then I wouldn't have to remember to set that alarm or whatever the thing was. And
like the backup beeper that he put on your car,
my gosh,
so it sounds like a semi truck.
That thing was so obnoxious. God rest his soul. He put that in my car. When I went into college, you put that backup beeper on my car. And
most embarrassing.
I would beep up, beep 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 every time I was backing out of the parking lot, out of the dorm parking lot. People would look at me. It was absolutely humiliating, but God love him. Anyway, it didn't bother him if he tried some gadget that he had rigged up, and you know, if that didn't work, he just went back to it. No, I don't know, that didn't work. Let me try it this way, you know. And then eventually he figured it out, or he so enjoyed the challenge and the process of finding a solution that even when he made a mistake or it didn't work quite right, it was invigorating to him in the best way. Like the challenge of maybe not getting it right the first time didn't make him want to just say, I'm done.
I feel like that's pretty low stakes when you're tinkering with things in your own house. There's not a lot of maybe fear of failure riding on that, because it's not something that really anyone else is going to see outside of your immediate family and friends, perhaps.
Right.
And so maybe we need to differentiate between actions taken in a more personal environment vis-a-vis those that have more riding on them, as far as maybe trying to have a book or album published. And it's not that every IN type even needs to do something of that nature, but I do think that when we're talking about just larger life choices in general, be it a career or having a baby in our case, that we can, as INs, become paralyzed by fear or the need to keep preparing, that inhibits us from maybe taking action as early as we should. What I've personally learned is even having small wins where I've taken action and sort of overcome my fear, even if it's just talking to a stranger or something small like that, it does build confidence that flows over into other aspects of our lives. So if we're constantly pulling back and shying away and saying, I'm not ready, I don't think that serves us well in our overall growth as individuals either.
I guess the point that I was trying to make was that, like when it came to my grandpa, and I think, again, in the case of like a lot of these ES types, it's like, you know, the fish gotta swim concept, that if you're built to do a thing within your given personality type, especially something that pertains to the top part of the function stack, either the dominant function or the auxiliary function, you're going to do that thing, whatever the obstacles are, whatever the challenges are. And yes, maybe the stakes get higher because we're talking about performing an aria at the Met and not like in our own shower. And so yes, naturally, if you're an opera singer, the stakes go up. But like the point is kind of that the tolerance level, the increasing risk that you're willing to take on, it's easier to keep moving into that risk when it's already caters to the top part of your function stack. Because
So you're saying that part of the reason why IN types may struggle to act is because they may not even realize it, but what they're trying to do actually has more to do with their inferior functions than it does their dominant functions.
Yes.
So for me as an INTP, if I'm saying I can't figure out why I just can't talk to strangers very easily or this sort of thing, you're saying that's actually a higher hanging fruit or something that INTPs maybe shouldn't focus on as an immediate goal perhaps, but rather working with the TI, NE functions, introverted thinking, extroverted intuition, that would allow to function like your grandfather was, and as far as being an innovator and constantly using those skills to tweak and create and modify whatever technologies he was into at the time.
Right. And I mean, I would say that the natural pattern of growth from like the time we're children going on is probably to start small and to do increasingly challenging tasks that largely cater to the top part of our stack, if possible. But if we try to just jump right in and do like what you described as the high hanging fruit, try to achieve the goal of the inferior function quickly and,
Which would be like for an INFJ being like an ESTP in something.
Right.
Like showing the skill and effortless flow of action, body in motion, perhaps, as an ESTP.
Right, and like courage. Like, I think it would take a lot out of an INFJ to decide to just like suddenly run into a burning building and become a firefighter overnight. Like that level of kind of just like...
caution to the wind.
Yeah, the sheer kind of physical
daringness,
to kind of tempt dangerous conditions and circumstances in the same way that a lot of ES types get, thrills out of any kind of seemingly life-threatening kind of, whether it's whitewater rafting or, skydiving or mountain climbing. Those are behaviors that most INJs are just not instinctually drawn to do, that they're, and so to wake up one morning and say, I'm just going to go climb a mountain today, it's like, whoa, might want to start with like, a little bit of a challenging hike before you try to climb a mountain, I mean, that's the thought.
So in a way, you're taking a very IN approach right now in basically framing our discussion to make us aware of which types of actions that we should be pursuing or focusing on as far as our type is concerned. Yeah. And what do you see as some of the more subtle... I know like most INFJs aren't going to want to dive in and become firefighters tomorrow. Right. That's a pretty obvious example and something probably, 1 in 100 might even consider.
Right.
So what would be an example of a more subtle type of temptation? Does it have more to do with, like, for an INJ type, controlling the outcome of something? And in what way does that affect?
Well, certainly, and I mean, again, sorry to keep, let me just keep promoting my book here, but certainly I wrote about this at length in the book, which is the need to perform, I describe them as simulations, like the need to perform tasks that kind of emulate or mimic or have some basis in reality, but with like far less risk consequence. So it's like, I'm probably not going to enlist in the army, but I might play like a video game, World of Warcraft. I don't know. Ask me. I don't even play video games. So. I'm not the one.
I'm sorry. I can't help you much with that either.
Yeah, but that's a considerably lower stakes form of trying out what it might kind of sort of feel like to move into action. But there's always a temptation to do something that has real life impacts. And maybe an INJ is content playing video games for a while, but reaches a point, one hopes, in like midlife where they realize that like, gee, am I really making an impact or improving the world for the better? Not to knock gamers out there if you're listening, but there may well come a point if you're an INJ where it's not enough to keep dress rehearsing, so to speak. It's not enough to keep kind of trying to build that inferior function skill, but without really risking anything. And by no risk, no reward, right? So like not really affecting meaningful change.
I know an INTJ who is the most prolific planner and preparer I've ever met. He is constantly amassing information, and I believe he spent about 4 years developing a business plan for his business that has yet to be started. And it's just kind of an example of just the ceaseless and gratuitous preparation that can be done for something, but always tending to find a reason not to actually take the action that you're planning for.
Right. But I feel like before you go and just
Throw shade on INTJs.
Yeah, like absolutely. Like there needs to be an understanding of the process and an understanding of where that comes from. And a good bit of it is rooted in what could arguably be described as authentic behavior on some level, which is at least not a little awareness that if I, as an INFJ, decided to become a firefighter tomorrow and run into a burning building that same day, things are likely to go very badly for me.
and for those
being rescued. And that some measure of good sense and instinct realizes that we don't really have everything it takes at that point in time or with that amount of skill that we have to perform that task well, but it's just not even clear to us like how we would know when we were fully ready. Nothing internally anyway seems to like alert us to the idea that, oh yeah, you're really ready for that. I mean, it's has the same feeling of like a baby bird being kicked out of the nest. Like it's like, whoa. And I know that we all, when it comes to being courageous, like there's always some element of that little bit of resistance, like, or we wouldn't need courage. That is what courage is, having the inner fortitude to like push through resistance and to push through whatever might be holding us back. But there's courage, and then there's just sheer stupidity. And INJs are a lot of things, but usually they're not stupid. And my sense is that a resistance to act comes from maybe on some level a knowingness about the lack of preparedness. And so you've got to start small. You've got to start with baby steps. And I'm not saying that an INJ could never be a firefighter if that's really what they aspired or dreamed to do. Like, more power to them. But I'm also saying that the investment of practice time in an kind of increasingly, like, you increase the stakes as you go in a gradual and reasonable manner. And I just think it is going to take a lot more guts and courage to do it than it would an ESTP.
I found that IN types are often told by others, like, you have so much potential, or others just see how smart they are, how creative they are, and are just baffled that these abilities aren't being put into practice more readily. And it seems like the INJ or the IN types in general are oftentimes slow to believe what other people are telling them, and it's like their internal caliber is not calibrated to the same degree of whatever other people are sensing they're not sure of in themselves. And some of it, I think, does arise from maybe just the reluctance to act, or imposter syndrome, or a general lack of self-confidence or self-esteem just keeps holding them back. And it's like the longer they wait, the more, well, on the one hand, there feels like more pressure to act to avoid regret. It also, there's also more like self-consciousness because they haven't acted for so long that it can snowball into a variety of self-doubts and concerns.
Right. I'm sensitive to this topic too, because, I think people mean well. I've certainly heard it in my lifetime, and I am sure other INJs have heard it in their lifetime, that, oh, you could have done this and you could be that. And I think people are well-meaning. I think they, like you say, it's like they see something, they see a lot of potential, and they're excited by that, or want greatness for the IN type. And like you said,
they want to see it materialized.
Right, but you have to understand that so does the IN type. Like, so does the INJ. Your INTJ friend who has been working on a business plan for 4 years, I mean, they want it too. It's the how. It's the question of like, how do I find...
We sometimes describe that as how do you get from N to S? If N is your dominant function,
Right.
how do you bridge between that and your inferior S function,
Right.
which is the function of action?
And the beauty of the function stack, of course, is that it's right there, like you see it. The bridge is the middle of the stack. It is that auxiliary and tertiary function somehow being kind of gradually developed as a pathway toward a more authentic inferior function. Because what often ends up happening in the growth process is not that we just, you think, oh, you move from A to B to C to D. You start with the dominant, and then you move to the auxiliary, and then, and then the tertiary, and finally you reach the inferior. That's not at all really how growth works. More often it's this kind of violent push and pull, this tug of war between the dominant and inferior function right out of the gate. Somewhere along the way, the auxiliary function starts to also kind of pop up and develop, but there are more kind of tug of war forces going on back and forth, attempts to jump the stack is how we describe that, quote unquote, jumping the stack as moving from the dominant straight to the inferior function without really giving the middle stack
functions
its
their
due.
fair due.
Right. And at least from my experience and work with personality, it does seem like the middle two functions perform a really essential role in making the bridge, the transition from dominant to inferior function fulfillment feel authentic. And that's something that you can't even, exactly, I would need to think more about how it is that you would flesh that out, or really just, what do I mean
So
by
let's
that?
just give an example. The way I would think about that is for INJs, INTJs would lead with NI, introverted intuition, and they would have extroverted thinking as their auxiliary function.
Right.
And so what it would mean is developing that auxiliary TE function, so that instead of just living in their ideas, living in the mind, or their insights, they would actually be expressed in some way.
Yes.
And so instead of being cloistered up in their house playing video games or something like that, they're dispensing their knowledge or insight in some sort of productive forum.
That's right. That's right.
And the same actually would be for INFJs.
INFJs.
It's virtually the same process for those two types, only that INTJs and INFJs may have slightly different interests or modes of application for their N insights.
Right, or how they're applied. For INTJs, I think, like you said, like having that kind of TE structure, and by TE structure I mean usually to be of advantage to some kind of company or work,
scientific
like
or
organization, or
perhaps.
university research or that kind of thing, where there's this forum, like you said, for that J expression or that outward expression of the things that the NI mind is kind of pulling
It's
up.
basically giving structure to the NI insight, essentially.
Right. And same thing for INFJs, but again with the auxiliary function being FE instead of TE, it's interpersonal or in relationship. And so that's why you see probably the best iteration of INFJs kind of coming forward in scenes like counseling and
the ministry, perhaps, or
yes.
anything working with people where you're providing
or human resources or something where there's a engagement with socially.
The challenge for the INFJ is always like, how can I engage with people without just having small talk with other people?
But that really is the gateway to S action. There's a doing in the presenting of one's ideas. There's a doing in the finding a forum in which the INJs, and again we keep zeroing in on INJs, perhaps because, like I said, this problem of...
You think the problem of action is more severe in INJs than it is in
I would argue
INTPs.
that it is, yeah.
What my only objection to that would be, so let's take INTPs for example with the inferior FE function. Yeah. There can still be a lot of inaction when it comes to like their relationships, for instance, right?
Oh yeah.
So even though S in a way, the sensing function is associated with action vis-a-vis reflection, there is still action that's sort of appropriate for INTPs, that is often not taken. Like, I'm just going to sit back and kind of ignore the relationship, or just let it work itself out, instead of actually stepping up and trying to communicate and talk about issues.
Right. But what I think you're pointing to, though, is a truth about all types, which is that quote unquote action. And I guess that's the problem with the word action, is that it can be loosely defined to mean lots of different things.
This is what I love about Elaine. She's always great at like turning things on its head and making you think differently about terms, because it's all relative, right? It's all relative to the type.
Right. So, right. I'm saying that everyone, when it comes to the inferior function, we all, in some ways, tend to drag our feet, particularly when we feel challenged or we feel fearful. You know, there's a
we procrastinate with regard to the inferior function.
Yes. And so, insofar as procrastination, you know, looks like inaction, I think it's true that all types, whether they're S types or N types, procrastinate or give into inaction on some level. The inaction just may look different for the different types. So for like ES types, the inaction may be a lack of inner reflection on something. The pitfall for ES types seems to be arguably springing into action a lot, maybe too much, maybe too quickly, too impulsively, without thinking about, hold on, wait a minute, maybe this isn't a great idea, or maybe, you know, I should think this through a little bit more and analyze the potential pitfalls before I just ram forward with this agenda.
What am I missing? The bigger question is, what am I missing in life, generally speaking, which itself is kind of an end question. Like, let's step back and ask what I'm missing in life by just staying so busy, staying in constant action and constant doing, that
there may be like inner psychological, emotional, spiritual struggles or internal thing going on with them that they use action to avoid examining or dealing with, right? They've got hurts or pains from their past or whatever they may be, that in order to never be given the kind of the still and the quiet to like sit back and really reflect on those things, they just keep moving ahead with doing, because the being still and being alone in their own head, so to speak, feels so uncomfortable and disquieting to them, in the same way that like
diving into action uncomfortable for an INJ.
Exactly.
Right.
That inaction, in quote unquote inaction, for some of these, for some ES types.
So for an ES type, say for an athlete, having a career-ending injury or simply having to retire or not making it or something like that would be, in a way, that would be an opportunity, an opening for reflection.
For psychospiritual reevaluation, and to say, okay, I was moving down this path of life, it was going really well, then I got injured, and now what am I going to do? What am I going to do with my life? I mean, IN types are asking themselves that question like on a virtually constant basis, I would argue, whereas ES types maybe a little bit less often, so long as what they're doing is working well for them.
So yes, in those moments where we hit rock bottom or hit a really low place in our life, that is often a pivotal moment where an ES type may choose to do some deeper self-reflection on the sort of broader course and contours of their lives. But at these inflection points, I feel like we can either choose to just keep kind of hammering away with old ways and old habits, or we can try to turn the corner and move in a different direction that might open the way toward growth, whether that's for an ES type or an IN type.
I agree with that, but I think that as human beings, we have a tendency of staying in our comfort zone, even when our comfort zone, like if you're an ES type, even when your comfort zone looks like rushing into action or being action driven. And so anytime we're asked to like reverse course or do something a little bit different, or arguably very different, go to the opposite, those are always opportunities for growth. That's certainly a healthy way to look at it, but we're so slow to embrace that opportunity as an opportunity. Instead, it feels like a setback that just requires more determination, more doubling down. You know, if we're an IN type, we think it requires more analysis, more running around in our own mind, more scrutiny. And if you're an ES type, you think it takes more action, more pushing harder, faster, more intensely to break through whatever that barrier is. And so it can take a lot to kind of...
Seems like the anticipated pain of not changing course almost has to outweigh the pain of continuing as you've been doing.
Right. And if we were all enlightened, we would be able to just change course without kind of life bringing us to a point that it more or less kind of
brings us to our knees.
Yeah, but we're all human, and we all...
But I don't want to sound dire, though. I do think that it is possible to take small steps.
It is.
And I like the concept of small wins. If you can set yourself up on a trajectory of getting small wins in the area that you want to make progress, it is possible to do things gradually, not to have to learn the hard way, so to speak.
I agree. All right. Well, so with this small win...
we got our first podcast under our belt
after
4 years of having babies and producing books.
IN foot dragging is what that is. We did that. So anyway,
well, we appreciate anyone who is able to hang in there with us, and I hope you come back and listen to us soon.
Thanks, guys.
Enjoyed this podcast and would like to support it, you can do so in several ways. In addition to purchasing our books and personality tests, you can contribute through the support page on Personality Junkie. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution, you can do so through our Patreon page, which we link to in the footer of our website. Patreon supporters can enjoy a variety of benefits, such as access to unpublished material, complimentary copies of our upcoming books, as well as input on post and podcast topics. Your contributions make it possible for us to continue to provide quality posts and podcasts. Thank you for your support.